On the surface, crime and punishment is a simple affair. You commit a crime and you should face a suitable punishment. But much like anything else in life, there are very few cases that are black and white. And while many may believe that if you commit the ultimate crime of taking a life, you should forfeit your own, today we look at a case where that exact exchange took place, but which led to an outcry that eventually resulted in the abolishment of capital punishment in the UK. Today, we'll look at the case of Ruth Ellis. Ruth Ellis was born Ruth Nielsen in the Welsh coastal town of Rhyl on Saturday, October the 9th, 1926, the fifth of 6 children of Elisabetha Goethals and Arthur Nielsen. Bertha was a Belgian war refugee and Arthur a cellist from Manchester who had changed his original surname, Hornby, to Nielsen after the birth of Ruth's older sister, Muriel, in 1925. The first tragedy hit the family when Ruth was just 2 years old. In 1928, Arthur's twin brother died in a horrific accident when his bike collided with a steamroller. He was only 31 years old. The same year, another son, John, was born, and just for a moment, he helped Arthur overcome his grief. But then, little John also passed away in March 1929. The Nielsens moved around often, and after the 2 tragedies, they soon upped sticks again, moving to Basingstoke in Hampshire. However, a dark shadow still loomed over the family. According to Ruth's older sister, Muriel, their father had become physically and sexually abusive after his brother's death. In her book, Ruth Ellis, My Sister's Secret Life, Muriel writes that the horrible violence eventually culminated in the birth of a child in August 1936, when she was 16 years old. Allegedly, Bertha was well aware of the situation and pretended to be the child's mother. However, police still questioned Arthur, but no action was taken. In addition, Muriel says that her father turned his attention to Ruth when she reached puberty, but she fought back. She stated that Ruth once told her, "I'm not letting him do to me what he's done to you." She goes on to say her sister never went through exactly what she did, but that she was still terribly frightened of Arthur and suffered a lot. Ruth's behaviour changed when she reached her teens. She began to run away, refusing to explain where she had been. She briefly attended Fairfield Senior Girls' School in Basingstoke, but left when she was 14 without any qualifications. However, she always made it clear she was not going to let a lack of education hold her back. Bertha once said about her daughter, "She wasn't like my other children. She was very ambitious for herself. She used to say, 'Mum, I'm going to make something of my life.'" After leaving school, Ruth started working as an usherette at the Central Cinema and Cafe in Reading, Berkshire. But then something unexpected happened. Her father, Arthur, was offered the live-in position of caretaker chauffeur at Pawn and Dunwoody lift manufacturers. He left for London in 1940 and Ruth followed him. Though she wasn't alone, Ruth's eldest brother, Julian, served in the Royal Navy and was home on leave. He brought with him his latest squeeze, Edna Turvey. Despite her being 30 and Ruth 14, the pair struck up a keen friendship, and when Julian returned to the Navy, things would take a bizarre turn. Ruth's sister Muriel states that it was Edna who first got Ruth into the fast life. This may have been one of the reasons that led to the pair running off to London together, finding Ruth's father and lodging with him. He hadn't changed his ways, however, and continued abusing Ruth, though apparently this wasn't enough to satisfy his loathsome urges, and when his wife Bertha paid him a surprise visit, she caught him in bed with Edna. Edna was quickly on her way, and the rest of Ruth's family would eventually make the move to London. During the midst of World War II, Ruth was trying to live the life of a typical teenager. This included sneaking out of the house to party, though at the time most of the locations available to do so were either dingy bars or air raid shelters that had been commandeered to serve the same purpose. These parties would often have many off-duty soldiers from overseas in attendance. With their flashy uniforms and abundance of things like watches, rings and cigarettes, rare items at the time, they seemed very exotic to the women of Britain. One in particular caught Ruth's eye, a French-Canadian soldier named Claire André McCallum. The pair soon started a relationship, and early in 1944, the now 17-year-old Ruth fell pregnant. This caused much upheaval. Ruth's parents disapproved of the pregnancy, and the local hospital turned away women who were bearing illegitimate children. This resulted in her leaving for a nursing home hundreds of miles away in Gilsland, Cumbria, giving birth on September 15, 1944. She named her new son Claire Andrea Nielsen, though he would be known as Andy. At the time of his birth, his father was away in France. Despite promises to marry Ruth after the war, this would never happen, as it was revealed that he was already married with a family back in Canada. He sent money to Ruth for a year before sending her a bunch of red roses and severing contact. Understandably, Ruth was distraught and felt abandoned. To support her young son, she worked in factories and had several clerical jobs. However, these were not very well paid, and she decided to find something better. Often receiving compliments about her looks and figure, Ruth decided to try nude modelling. This paid vastly more than her previous jobs and eventually led her to becoming a nightclub hostess in Hampstead. But even though Ruth was now earning a good amount of money, it didn't come without significant drawbacks. Whilst at the Court Club on Duke Street, she worked for Maurice Conley, a man who was notorious for blackmailing his female employees into sleeping with him. By early 1950, having been used by men her whole life, Ruth began making money as a full-service escort, but she would eventually fall pregnant to one of her regular clients. She would go on to have an illegal termination 3 months in. On November the 8th, 1950, Ruth married a 41-year-old man named George Johnson Ellis, a divorced dentist and, unfortunately, an alcoholic who was prone to violence when drunk. On top of that, there were money issues and George's ongoing fixation with his ex-wife, his possible affairs with other women, and Ruth's jealousy. Overall, the relationship between the two was anything but stable. Still, Ruth eventually fell pregnant and her second child was born in 1951. However, George refused to acknowledge their daughter, Georgina, as his own. Soon after, Ruth and George went their separate ways. Ruth, Andy, and Georgina moved in with her parents, and she went back to hostess and escort work to support the family. By 1953, Ruth found herself managing a nightclub here at 37 Brompton Road in Knightsbridge, aptly named the Little Club. By then, she was well known for her beauty and indeed her signature peroxide blonde hair. She was lavished with expensive gifts from her admirers and indeed had many celebrity friends. Two men would soon enter Ruth's life. Desmond Cussens, a wealthy businessman and former Royal Air Force pilot, and David Blakely, a race car driver introduced to her by British Formula One driver Mike Hawthorne. David was 3 years younger than Ruth and the son of a Scottish doctor. When his parents divorced, his mother married a motor racer from whom he got his interest in the field. David was well educated and, at the time, had 2 flats in his use, one in Penn in Buckinghamshire and one in London. Despite his apparently upper-class upbringing, David's major interests were fast cars, women, and alcohol. Within weeks, David was all but living in Ruth's apartment, which was situated at the club, despite the fact he had 2 flats of his own and despite being engaged to another woman. Ruth and David's relationship can be described as a tempestuous affair that fluctuated from physical passion to physical abuse. It was sex, drink, and violence. They loved and hated each other in equal measure. Leaving that kind of relationship can be extremely difficult, and Ruth's situation was a model example of that. During this time, Ruth became pregnant for the 4th time, but had a second abortion as she felt David was not committed enough to their relationship. She started seeing Desmond. He was besotted and would do anything for Ruth. He was 32, he was eligible, and he welcomed Ruth into his home, here at number 20 Goodwood Court, Devonshire Street, West 1. However, 27-year-old nightclub manager wasn't quite finished with David Blakely just yet. The two continued to see each other, even though their relationship was increasingly more violent and both were seeing other people. At one point, David offered to marry Ruth, with her saying yes. This soon changed after he caused her to miscarry in January 1955 when he punched her in the stomach during an argument. In February 1955, police were called to Desmond's apartment, where David said Ruth had tried to stab him. When they arrived, they found Ruth covered in bruises, with a black eye and problems walking, but apparently there were no further investigations into the event. In April, David, who had been selected to race at Le Mans, gave Ruth a photograph signed "To Ruth with all my love." A few days later, on Good Friday, he had again changed his mind and told his friends Anthony and Carol Findlater that he never wanted to see Ruth again. As David never returned to her flat, Ruth desperately telephoned the Findlaters, who simply ignored her. Ruth had previously suspected David of having an affair with Anthony and Carol's babysitter, and for her, him being in their flat without answering was unbearable. Ruth then called Desmond, who took her to the Findlaters' residence. One can only guess why this poor man, who was in love with Ruth, was willing to drive her to see another man, especially as the situation escalated to Ruth screaming at David and his friends. Nevertheless, Desmond took Ruth back home afterwards, but that was not the end of it. David and the Findlaters spent Easter weekend together. Then, on the 10th of April 1955, David came here to the Magdala Tavern to buy some cigarettes and beer with his friend, Clive Gunnell. As David drove off from the Findlaters to the Magdala, he was spotted by Ruth, who had taken a taxi from Desmond's to the Findlaters in the hope of finding David there. She paid off the taxi and walked a quarter of a mile to the tavern. And then she waited. Around 9:30 p.m, David and Clive emerged. And as David was looking for his car keys, Ruth approached him with a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson Victory model revolver in her hand. She fired the handgun, but the first shot did not hit the target, giving David a brief moment to try to escape. The second bullet, however, hit its mark, causing David to collapse onto the pavement. Ruth then stood over David and fired 3 more shots. One was fired so close to his back it left burns on his skin. Several people witnessed the shooting, and one person, Gladys Yule, was injured on her hand by the 6th bullet that Ruth fired into the ground after the gun first jammed, the bullet ricocheting up off the concrete. Whilst we're here, it's worth mentioning that the landlady of this pub in the 90s drilled a couple of holes in the wall, and thus began the legend that this is where the bullets struck. It was, of course, a ruse, and one can only imagine put forward to boost trade. Ruth was then arrested by an off-duty policeman who reportedly heard her saying, "I'm guilty. I'm a little confused." There was nothing anybody could have done for David. He had been fatally injured, having wounds on his trachea, aorta, lung, liver, and intestines. And so, David Blakely was pronounced dead on arrival at the New End Hospital. At 11 p.m. that night, Ruth admitted shooting David in the presence of senior CID officers. At 12:30 a.m., she was charged with murder and was examined twice by a medical officer and again by psychiatrist Dr. D. Whitaker for the defence and by Dr. A. Dalzell on behalf of the Home Office, but none of them found any signs of mental illness. That, of course, does not mean Ruth was in her right mind when she decided to shoot David, especially after continuous abuse. On June the 20th, 1955, Ruth appeared briefly in the No. 1 Court at the Old Bailey, London, before Mr. Justice Havers. Her appearance gathered much attention both inside and outside the courtroom. Ruth was wearing a black suit and white silk blouse, her hair freshly bleached, her trademark blonde. Ruth's defence had expressed their concerns about their client's looks, saying it might be better if she looked less striking. But Ruth did not want to change how she was. During the hearing, only one question was asked to Ruth by prosecutor Christmas Humphreys. It was, when you fired the revolver at close range into the body of David Blakely, what did you intend to do? Ruth's answer was simple. It's obvious. When I shot him, I intended to kill him. Needless to say, it only took the jury 20 minutes to come up with the verdict and convict her, which meant the mandatory death sentence. Ruth was sent to Holloway Prison to await her execution. She herself did not want to appeal her rulings, but that did not stop others from trying. A public outcry ensued, culminating with her solicitor, John Bickford, writing a 7-page letter to Home Secretary Gwilym Lloyd George setting out the grounds for reprieve, along with a petition to the Home Office that had been signed by some 50,000 people, though the request was denied. In her last days, Ruth wrote a letter to David's parents saying, I have always loved your son, and I shall die still loving him. On July the 13th, 1955, just before 9 a.m., the hangman, Albert Pierpoint, and his assistant took Ruth Ellis to the adjacent execution room where she was hanged. Albert later said that Ruth smiled at him just before the execution. She was buried in an unmarked grave within the walls of Holloway Prison, as was customary at the time. In the early 1970s, Ruth's remains were exhumed alongside other executed women and were reburied in the churchyard of St Mary's Church in Amersham, Buckinghamshire. The case, its outcome, and the subsequent media attention had a massive impact on the remaining family members. George Ellis was consumed by his alcoholism and committed suicide in 1958. In 1969, Ruth's mother was discovered unconscious in a gas-filled room. She survived, but would never make a full recovery, never speaking coherently again. And in 1982, Ruth's son, Andy, committed suicide shortly after desecrating his late mother's grave. His funeral was paid for by Christmas Humphreys, the man who had served as the counsel for the prosecution in his mother's murder case. Ruth's fate strengthened the idea that capital punishment does not have a place in modern society, and 10 years later, it was abolished. Her hangman on that day, Albert Pierpoint, who had hanged over 400 criminals over his career, hanged only one more person after Ellis, and later went on to say, capital punishment is said to be a deterrent. I cannot agree. There have been murders since the beginning of time, and we shall go on looking for deterrents until the end of time. If death were a deterrent, I might be expected to know. It is I who have faced them last. Young lads and girls, working men, grandmothers. I have been amazed to see the courage with which they take that walk into the unknown. It did not deter them then, and it had not deterred them when they committed what they were convicted for. All the men and women whom I have faced at that final moment convince me that in what I have done, I have not prevented a single murder. It must be said, however, that he seems to have gone back and forth over his support for capital punishment after his retirement. What do you think about this case and capital punishment? Do you think Ruth's punishment was justified? Let us know in the comments below. And whilst I have your undivided attention, let me wind the clock all the way back to 1954, to number 11 specifically, across the road. Stilo Pontopaio Christofi, a Greek Cypriot matriarch, killed her son's wife, Hella Lycia, strangling her and burning the body. Stilo was hanged several months before Ellis, making her the penultimate woman to face that particular punishment. But why am I telling you this? Well, whilst the two cases are often mentioned together, a lesser known fact is that the two women committed their crimes just 100 yards apart. And along with that bonus information, I'd like to say thank you for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time with another story that will make you say, well, I never.